I'm Marshall Kosloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
My guest for today's episode is Adam Hammer. Adam is the co-founder and CEO of Roadrunner Venture Studios. Roadrunner is investing and building in the deep tech space, focused on frontier technologies, ones that would determine the path of the United States when it comes to great power competition and innovation in the 21st century. We go through the nature of what deep tech is, we discuss the different funding models for these innovative companies, and the lessons learned from Roadrunner's efforts in New Mexico so far.
The Sputnik moment really was a wake-up call. And that was the moment where I think the United States decided, look, we need to win in this space. The arsenal of democracy might have been on the battlefields at Normandy 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier, but in this new generation, it's going to be at the lab. It's going to be, fought with people in white coats doing deeply disruptive research. We have to win in that battle. It is abundantly clear that when a state leads in deep tech and leads in a lot of these kind of core research areas, it benefits the economy, it benefits job growth, it benefits security and competitiveness. And I think when the United States is leading in those areas, the world is better off for it as well.
Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Adam Hammer, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Marshall, great to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm glad to chat. We have so much to cover. This podcast is obviously titled Arsenal of Democracy. You actually do a decent amount of defense-focused work, both in your prior lives, but also in your position at the Atlantic Council. Before we get into Roadrunner Venture Studios, deep tech, all of those things, I'd love to hear just your summation of thoughts on where things stand from a Arsenal of Democracy, industrial-based perspective.
Well, I think this is a moment in time where the stakes feel quite high, I think, for the United States as we really enter now what we're calling great power competition. That great power competition previously was really around, weapon development, but today it's also around, are you leading in research and development? What does your domestic industrial base look like? And do you have an innovative startup base that's pushing the envelope in innovation and really pushing forward in the lab new types of technologies that could be used both commercially and by government? So I think we're seeing a reframing of great power competition and competition more broadly to really be around deep tech, which I know is going to be part of what you and I discussed today. And I think Americans are waking up to real stakes around U.S. leadership in this space.
That was the perfect answer, because a real goal of mine in this episode is to discuss the ways that the very DC-centric defense technology conversation both rhymes with, but is different than the deep tech frontier technology conversation. But let's kind of start by going into your background and what you're working and building on first. So you are CEO of Roadrunner Venture Studios. Could you just introduce what led you to this point? And then that gives you a chance to sort of explain what Roadrunner Venture Studios is.
Absolutely. I have this awesome privilege of building and leading Roadrunner Venture Studios. I'm actually here in our office in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We've got a great team that's come together over the last year and a half. We launched, formally in December of 2023 at our first Roadrunner Tech Forum. We were at that point kind of a seedling of an idea, a deep tech venture studio, and we launched with our partners at America's Frontier Fund to really take on this mission of creating new products and new companies that are important to American competitiveness and American security. We're a venture studio, so it's a little different than accelerators and incubators. We're starting with the raw idea. It can be, a patent coming out of a national lab. It can be a product in wireframe. It can be a great idea written up on a whiteboard. And we take that raw, disruptive idea and we turn it into a company. The easiest way to think about what we're doing at Roadrunner is a company creation factory. And I come at this from a few different experiences. So I started my career at Goldman Sachs, working in capital markets, again, working with industrial companies, large corporations, thinking carefully around M&A activity, thinking about new ideas, to revitalize the American industrial base. I moved from Goldman into a place called Schmidt Futures. Schmidt Futures was a venture facility for public benefit started by former Alphabet CEO and chairman Eric Schmidt and his wife Wendy Schmidt. There we were really thinking about moonshot ideas and people, products, and ideas that could change the world. That's where I did a lot of the kind of early thinking with great colleagues of mine like Jordan Blaszczak, who we both know, who's now at America's Frontier Fund, to think about how we could build a factory at Schmidt Futures to de-risk these ideas for capital markets. So we realized that in venture and in philanthropy, you're still such a small share of the amount of capital and resources in the world. We thought that the mission of a place like Schmidt Futures was to take these early ideas and crowd in government, crowd in capital markets to really catapult those disruptive ideas to get more scale. There I was managing director and head of strategy. I left there to help run a post-quantum encryption quantum hardware business. This one gets closest to home to where we are at Roadrunner. A lot of our underlying technology actually came out of Los Alamos National Labs and Oak Ridge National Labs, as well as a Swiss lab called EPFL. And that's where I got some of the most hands-on experience building a deep tech company from the ground up, but also really opening my eyes to the amazing mass of incredible scientists, incredible engineers, and really amazing breakthrough innovations that are happening at many of our labs that frankly don't make it to market. And this was the seedling of the idea of could we build a venture studio that could take that disruptive research, build it into investable companies in parts of America that had been overlooked. The folks at America's Frontier Fund, Jordan Blaszczak, Gilman Louie, Steve Weinstein, Brian Wilco, Jeff Karras, they really kind of came up with this original concept in partnership with the New Mexico SIC, and I partnered with them to really build it out into what is Roadrunner Venture Studios today.
And not to get too inside baseball, but what is the SIC? Because it speaks to something interesting about the model of what this could be going forward and how folks should conceptualize. Because I really want folks not just to understand the deep tech venture concept, but also different ways that we could approach this innovation, funding, financing, creation perspective through different vehicles. So explain the SIC in New Mexico and why that matters.
Well, so the SIC is really the private equity fund of the state of New Mexico. And what they can do is, frankly, act like a sovereign wealth fund on behalf of a state. So New Mexico is blessed with a variety of natural resources, namely oil and gas and some mining, and that has helped fund what is now the State Investment Council. The State Investment Council, run now by a gentleman named John Clark, and really the venture program and private equity program run by Chris Cassidy and his colleague Bruce Brown. What they're doing is making strategic investments on behalf of the state into things like deep tech and into a private equity portfolio. We are lucky to be partnered with them. And you know what you need, to your point, Marshall, to really be successful, in deep tech, but also in this venture studio model where you start really at the seedling of an idea, is patient capital. You need strategic and patient capital. And SICs around the country, like New Mexico has done, is one of these actors that I think can look beyond the horizon to say, hey, this is really important. It's important to the country. It's important to our state. We have the benefit of patient capital. We can be quite risk on, and we want to make a bet on something like Roadrunner.
So what actually is, and this is where this gets difficult at a narrative perspective because everyone has a different term for this. Some people say this is deep tech, others say this is hard tech. You refer to this as frontier technologies on the Roadrunner Venture Studios website. Yeah. What is the category of tech we're actually talking about here?
So there's two ways to answer this. I think at the sort of theoretical and strategic level, when I think about deep tech or what we refer to as frontier tech, it's the types of technologies that are really integral and foundational to things like security and competitiveness and really undergird our way of life. So, to me, that really translates to advanced manufacturing, new materials science. It translates to new types of energy. So climate tech, hydrogen technology, all types of kind of fission, fusion, and also translates into what I'll call kind of microelectronics or compute. That's everything from sensing to new types of semiconductors. Think of the foundational technologies, elemental, like energy, manufacturing, materials science, and really the chips and microelectronics that really make our things go. Those are at the basis of what I think of frontier technology. And oh, by the way, it's at the very center of what I think is the new arsenal of democracy. We have to win in these categories in order to win the next generation and lead the world and the rules of the road for these deeply disruptive technologies.
So this is where this gets very fascinating. So when people tell the arsenal of democracy story, they look at our experience during World War II as sort of the prime, and then the early Cold War as just the prime example of what happens when this country could get all of the various parts of this picture aligned together. If you're thinking through the deep tech story in the context of these technologies and innovation during the Cold War period, where would you say was the height of America getting its act together and being effective in this category that we could call back to as an example?
The Sputnik moment. I'd say that was one particular inflection point where the United States, I think, publicly acknowledged and started to understand that they were behind in some of these areas of core technology. We had, of course, I think, had a lead coming out of World War II. Then, of course, you've seen the Soviet Union catch up in a lot of ways, and a lot of great books have been written about, I think, the surprise of the U.S. government about how quickly the Soviets were advancing in science and technology, research and development. And I think the Sputnik moment really was a wake-up call. And that was the moment where I think the United States decided, look, we need to win in this space. The arsenal of democracy might have been on the battlefields at Normandy 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier. But in this new generation, it's going to be at the lab. It's going to be, fought with people in white coats doing deeply disruptive research. We have to win in that battle. That will not only create, of course, new weapon systems, but also, more importantly, it creates totally new markets that add to our economic industrial base, add to the types of jobs that we can lead in. I mean, it is abundantly clear that when a state leads in deep tech and leads in a lot of these kind of core research areas, it benefits the economy, it benefits job growth, it benefits security and competitiveness. And I think when the United States is leading in those areas, the world is better off for it as well.
I'd like to talk about modern Sputnik moments. This obviously is a little inside baseball from a policy perspective, but it really feels like in the mid-2010s when China put out the Made in 2025 plan, that within policy circles and within tech circles really got a lot of centered thought on the idea that a great power rival at a very particularly important inflection point in China's relationship to the U.S. was going all in on saying that these technologies and their advancement is key to great power competition. So talk about how Made in China 2025 and its various, let's say, successes and failures have influenced the way folks have approached your space.
Yeah, I think that China Made in 2025, I think the recent focus, again, on semiconductors, partly because of COVID-19 and the supply chain disruptions, but also more broadly because of the pronouncements coming out of Beijing around the possibility of reunification with Taiwan, have really opened the eyes that, look, China is pretty fixated on reunifying with Taiwan, and moreover, pretty fixated on jettisoning the old bide your time, hide your intentions, which was previously really the paradigm that they operated under, to being much more vocal. You saw the sort of whiff warrior diplomacy. You've seen a lot of pronouncements from their Secretary of Defense and their broader military apparatus to really show that their intentions are to be a world power, are to lead in a lot of key areas. And I think the United States has woken up that, look, we have for a lot of years allowed our domestic industrial base to atrophy. We benefited from and have always led this neo-liberal world order and free trade, but the reality is that it's also benefited China in a lot of ways. And I think we've had a real rethinking of those basic economic paradigms to one, hey, listen, we too need to make certain technologies, particularly core technologies that, as I mentioned earlier, are foundational both to security and to economy here in the United States. But we also need to make sure that we're thinking around the corner around these technologies like quantum, like artificial intelligence, like synthetic biology, double down on research and development. We've seen R&D decline at a national level since that Sputnik moment. But I think you've seen through the Build Back Better, through the CHIPS Act, through the Inflation Reduction Act, there is this general reawakening of the United States. I think it's been well placed. And again, that's not all in the military context. It's also in the economic context, which is a really important part of this story to the American public. And I think we're reacting to, and I think doubling down on, making sure that the United States continues to lead in these key areas so that China Made in 2025 and other programs don't, again, have another Sputnik moment in 2030 saying, oh boy, we're terribly behind and the stakes are high and it's too late to catch up.
I'd like you to explain something you said earlier. You referred to patient capital being key in this category, because if you're just a policy person who thinks of investment and tech as being something that's important, it seems like the immediate response would be, okay, so we need to increase R&D. We need to seriously invest in these areas. They're clearly critical. After COVID, this is no longer a hypothetical. Let's just go. Why, even despite all of those dynamics, is patient capital still required? And this then brings us to the whole issue of why we need new models of investment, why traditional VCs just aren't going to do this, why we can't just pass a big bill in the government to make this just happen. Talk about patient capital and how it actually leads into the model that y'all are pursuing here.
Yes. So we think a lot about patient capital, both because we are one of the beneficiaries of it at Roadrunner, but we live in this world of deep tech, particularly at the early stages, which just by its nature, because it's high engineering risk, because it's really rooted in lab technologies that have oftentimes decades of research and development beforehand, we have to be patient investors. We are not patient builders. We say that all the time to our team and to our founders. We're about accelerating towards first customer, towards your first team. But what's important to us is to make sure that we have this really wide funnel where we're thinking about the technologies that have been developing in the lab for decades before they arrive at the studio. Patient capital is, the capital that's willing to invest in big, bold ideas. What I call, what we think of deep tech, and at Roadrunner we try to change what is, sci-fi into sci-fact. But that takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of time. Patient capital, or those that invest in those bold visions, are not assuming or looking for a return in the next 2, 3, 4 years, but really realizing that there are going to be major gains here. These are foundational technologies, but they are going to take 10 years to build. And when we think about it in the context of frontier technologies and more broadly in the venture studio, we start at the idea stage. So what's important to us is that we are looking for technologies that are not only disruptive, but we can assess is at least 36 months from could be generating revenue or could be productized. So when we go into a place like Los Alamos National Labs, where we often are doing some scouting, or at Lawrence Livermore, where we were last week, we're looking at a broad portfolio of disruptive technologies across manufacturing, energy, and microelectronics. But one way of cutting down the sort of ocean of amazing science and engineering that's happening in there is two things. One, we try to come in there with a really informed point of view on the problem sets that we know customers, whether they be again, the government or large enterprises are struggling with, that we can immediately map to a potential solution that's brewing in the lab. And also, we try to be very thoughtful around the timeline. What does it take for this technology to be successful? Venture capital is not responsible for building R&D. Really, that's the role of the government. And they're, like I said, I think stepping up to do that. We think that there's a gap between where R&D ends and where the capital markets begins. And venture studios, namely Roadrunner, should fill that chasm. We take things that are not investable yet, we bring them into the studio so that they are in the right form factor for capital markets and for venture funds. And that requires a lot of patient capital. And again, I think that patient capital is pretty critical to making sure these technologies see the light of day, they get to scale, and thus actually give the United States that asset that it can use on the world scale.
I'd love to hear, as much as you can talk about this, the motivations for folks who either invest as LPs in Roadrunner or just in general, because it seems to me you have a mix of motivation of patriotism. There's a pure policy motivation. We need to have this as a country versus what's the ratio of that to, hey, actually, if we could actually get 2 or 3 foundationally game-changing technologies, that's obviously going to be huge from a returns perspective. So how would you sort of balance the motivations when it comes to investors, LPs, states that you're speaking to, et cetera?
It's a great point. I think there's 3 instigating factors that folks get excited about Roadrunner. The number one is mission. People, Marshall, I think, are really buying into and believe and are starting to understand how important it is for the country to lead on things like advanced manufacturing, energy, and microelectronics. They understand how this sort of the downstream implications, again, not just for geopolitics, but also for, again, job growth and economic development. I think back to a conversation you and I have had in the past that the real mandate, I think, for the U.S. government right now and for many of our elected officials, but also for places like Roadrunner, is to show that, yes, these technologies are important for geopolitics. They're important for our military and our competitiveness, but they're also deeply, deeply impactful in creating new markets and new jobs and really new wealth in the United States. That is something that's resonated in places like New Mexico, where, I think for a lot of years they have felt overlooked. A lot of amazing technology that's come out of this state. In fact, we have an amazing wall exhibition in our office that has ingrained in it, actually the inventions since the late 1800s in New Mexico over time. And you're just reminded that in places like this, it has been these meccas for R&D and inventions. But the reality is that not a lot of companies have stayed here. They've moved to the coasts, or those technologies have actually been exported to other places in the States.
Microsoft's probably the ultimate one who got away here.
For sure. Microsoft is kind of the quintessential case study. And so you have one, I think, a real buy-in to the mission. What we're doing here matters. When Roadrunner succeeds, it's good for the country. When the country succeeds, it's good for America. And it's good for the world. 2, we are seeing that people believe in the reality that the technologies that we're investing in, Marshall, are really foundational to the next generation of unicorns. And so they love the upside of saying, at the venture studio, you're really getting in on the ground floor of companies that have incredibly disruptive potential. You're coming in as a co-founder. That's the role of the studio. Not at Series A, not at Series B, but really at kernel. And the kind of the economic ROI is really strong for the studio. And we believe that we'll have some meaningful exits at the end of this journey. And 3, I think, again, there's this kind of state by state effort that has really resonated with SICs and state legislatures around the country that have said, wow, how great would it be to have a company creation factory here? Not just capital markets, not just funds, but actually a place that's rolling up the sleeves, bringing entrepreneurs here, partnering with our local assets, our local R&D institutions and universities to build companies. It's kinetic, it's visible, it's also a training ground, and it's a talent hub that I think people get really excited by. Those 3 reasons have really instigated and pushed people towards Roadrunner. And frankly, I think that same thesis has measured up for places like Frontier Fund as well.
So here's just a pure tabula rasa question. When you describe patient capital, the motivations for it, the stakes for it, and just how it actually operates, why is the federal government, as it stands, just not basically serving that role? So obviously, in many ways, a lot of startups in both deep tech and defense tech are going to use the government as a literal customer oftentimes, but it seems like there's just a case for using government itself at a federal level because the monetary ability is there as just a provider of patient capital. Is there to what degree does that happen now? And to what degree is that just not something that makes sense for a variety of reasons that makes sense from your perspective?
I think that you are seeing the government lean into being first of all, a larger investor in research and development. We covered that earlier. I think that that's been a meaningful shift in the past few years. I think that you're also seeing new programs in the Department of Defense, namely the Office of Strategic Capital. You're seeing a revitalization and a really rebooting and rescaling of the Defense Innovation Unit. You are seeing more programs, more efforts to provide capital and really to partner with the capital markets and to be, again, that risk-on investor, sometimes to take first loss, sometimes to provide loans to companies and to funds. Again, a lot of that really kind of cutting edge financial market research is being done by the SBA in partnership with the DoD. But I think more broadly, the U.S. government, in my mind, plays a really integral role in making sure that they are maturing these technologies so that they are actually ready for commercialization. R&D doesn't change the world. What changes the world is our products and companies. And it's not the job of the U.S. government to actually productize or to build them into companies. But one of the things that they do play a critical role in is actually incubating these early ideas over years and years of basic and applied research. I think that that's a form of patient capital. I mean, they are looking around the corner to say, we think that, the developments we're making on synthetic biology are important. We should continue to fund that research around the country so that when it's mature, capital markets can take it from there. Those are some kind of areas that I'm seeing that the government is leaning into patient capital. I think you've seen a lot more of it in the last few years. And I think the partnership with the private sector in that sense has been phenomenal.
Something I'm curious about, you've made reference a couple of times to national labs. I'd like you just to, obviously most folks in these spaces have heard of these places, Los Alamos, et cetera, but can you just actually explain like what they are at a foundational level and how they fit into the existing ecosystem?
Yes. So national labs are an apparatus of labs around the country that fit within the Department of Energy. They're in places like New Mexico and California. They're in places like North Carolina. And what they're doing is really taking a lot of the research mandates that the Department of Energy is setting that, again, map to national priorities. And from there, they're doing a lot of the basic and applied research, oftentimes in partnership with universities, sometimes in partnership with the private sector, but really, again, to push the envelope around the development of that really basic R&D that can be published, that can be again, used and hopefully licensed to a corporation, to a startup, or to an external audience. One of the areas we're seeing a lot of focus when the national labs is, again, we think of them as a kind of an engine for basic and applied R&D in the country, but an area that they are spending much more time and much more focus is this concept of licensing out. Mm-hmm. So, okay, they've done the work over the past 4 or 5 years. Now they want to partner with places like Roadrunner and Frontier Fund and KOSLA and A16Z to say, hey, we've got a scientist or a postdoc and we have some amazing research we've been working on at the hands of the Department of Energy for the last 4 or 5 years. We think it's ripe for productization. We think it's ripe for the capital markets. There's been a increased focus, and it's welcomed from my point of view, to partner with private sector to actually spin those technologies out and get them out into the world and built into something. Now, what happens is those patents are actually still owned by the U.S. government, and there is a monetary financial relationship where when that patent, when that research is productized and is used in a company, there actually is a flow back of capital to the labs in a meaningful way. It's good for the labs, it's good for the country, and it's good for the private sector. And you're seeing a much greater focus around that commercialization. It's pretty integral to the work that we're doing at Roadrunner.
Last question before the final section. If one knows one's history of research and development in the aftermath of World War II, one will know that places like Bell Labs were key to innovation and research and patient capital and just spending a lot of the time necessary to develop these technologies to their final, most useful form. So when you're describing what Roadrunner's doing and Roadrunner's overall thesis here, you're talking about we need to build more companies. We need a process, we need a factory to actually build companies. Why is and obviously I'm not saying that you need to be doing this, but why isn't part of the impetus here, we need to just have more Bell Labs, or we need to bring that model back? Like we already have these existing big companies who've been able to do this in the past. Why, for a variety of reasons, is that just not the path that we seem to be taking at a narrative level?
It's a great question. As somebody who's a student of history and a nerd around, early R&D and thinking about the pathway of the country over the last few years, I adore Bell Labs and places like Xerox PARC and the inventions that have come out of there are so foundational to so many of the things that we use. We've had the pleasure of partnering with Bell Labs, and now they're their corporate owner, Nokia, along with Frontier Fund on a few projects. So I've really gotten to look under the hood and understand the corporate lab model for the 21st century and see how it's changed in some ways for the better, in some ways it looks very different. And a lot of that is because of the capital markets and I think some of the short-term earning pressures that corporations have today that is increased from where they were in the 1960s. I mean, you're even seeing this in places like Google, where you're seeing a lot more focus on saying, okay, how do all the things that you're building in places like Google X actually contributing to the bottom line? That same conversation has been happening at places like Bell Labs, happening at Xerox PARC, happening at 3M, happening at GE. And so you are seeing a greater focus around making sure that the technologies are, again, pertinent to what product lines those companies are building. There's a little bit less room for experimental research. Bell Labs is one of the places that's actually still doing a lot of amazing experimental research to their credit and to Nokia's credit. But I think the reality of the pressures that we give big, large, publicly traded companies today make it hard to have these sort of idea factories thrive in the ways that they did in the 60s and 70s. But I will say that there's some opportunities that are framed around this that I think we at Roadrunner are pretty obsessed with. One of that is, I think because of that pressure, you are seeing more opportunity for spin-outs of corporate research. I predict we're going to see more of it over the next 5 years. We're seeing an uptick in the last 2 or 3 years. And again, these are technologies that were incubated and I think have a lot of potential, but are being sort of cast off, not for reasons related to the strength of the technology, but just because of the corporate earnings pressure that places like Google and Meta are facing. I also think that if you combine it with the studio model that we're building, they're actually pretty symbiotic. You have corporates that employ amazing scientists and are in the same building as the potential customer. And the brilliant work of studios is being able to start with a problem set where there's a customer on the other end. I mean, I think about the technologies and companies that we're building at Roadrunner today. Every single one of those started with a problem, usually in government, but sometimes in large corporates that have said, if you can solve this for me, if you can find a technology, build this into a product, and you can solve it for me, I will grab it out of your hands. No question asked. Well, the benefit of a lot of places like Bell Labs today and a lot of these corporate research facilities is that you have the scientists, the amazing developers in the same room in the same building as the folks that might actually have the problem sets in hand. So you can do that problem curation much, much faster, much more efficiently. And you can partner with a place like a venture studio to do all the work in between, to actually build out the team, make sure that we're doing a nationwide search to find the exact right operators, to do all the marketing work, to do the business development work. And so you go from, hey, I've got the R&D and the scientists, to I've got the problem. The venture studio can do all the things in between. So I think it's a phenomenal opportunity. I think there's a lot of ways to partner with corporate labs, but the model has just changed.
I love that answer because in the defense tech or let's say defense industrial based category, the more you study the space, the more you realize we can't just make it 1939, 1940 again when it comes to the nature of the fact that we had a different industrial base, we had a different automobile industry. And what you're really saying here, and I want to make clear for folks, is that as easy as it is to say, well, in the 60s, we had it figured out with these national labs, like the point you're making about capital markets and actual like market incentives are that just the world is just quite literally different. So what we're kind of trying to do here, and we have to do a version of this when it comes to the defense industrial base, is how do we take the legacy or the underlying idea here of how key these processes and ecosystems are and apply them to a transformed market and dynamic facing the country. So I think that's just very well said and I think very key to understanding. So for this last section, this will let me give a great shout out to the upcoming Roadrunner Technology Forum. You launched at last year's first forum. And what's been interesting about your venture studio specifically is that there's an actual idea here. There's a thesis about how the country needs to produce technology companies, how we can actually identify the right founders and researchers and work in those categories. So now that we've actually had a year of this actual process, I'd love to hear your just like immediate takeaways of this period of we have this idea. Now we've actually been grinding at this for a year. Would love to hear any like public like learnings you could offer people.
Yeah, plenty of learnings over the last year. One that is really at the forefront of a lot of the work and the kind of capability building that we're doing at Roadrunner now is, at the end of the day, deep tech can sometimes fall prey to over-indexing on the technology, the engineering, and the technical analysis. We pride ourselves in being able to understand the tech really, really well, to go into places like Los Alamos and Sandia and universities around America and really go toe-to-toe with amazing scientists and say, let's understand this at its core and figure out how we can productize it. The danger of that is all needed. But at the end of the day, successful companies are about amazing founders. Mm-hmm. And what I've learned over the last year is, of course, we knew founders were at the core of any company. But it is actually that founders, not the technology, are the constraints in deep tech. There is amazing technology out there. We are awash, frankly, with highly disruptive, potentially disruptive engineering and science in this country. It's one of our superpowers. The constraint is finding amazing founders that can take those kernels of ideas, partner with places like us to build them out. And we are really doubling down on our Entrepreneur in Residence program and finding ways to map to operators and again, to actually do the hard work of making a problem set or a technology that we're super excited about it theirs. If you think about it, the beauty of the venture studio is we have to give our kernel of an idea to a founder and a CEO to make their own. And we are hyper-focused on getting that right. It's been one of the really fun lessons working with our early founders and we have two amazing entrepreneurs in residence, Darren and Mark, who joined Roadrunner this year, and finding more Darrens and Marks and partnering with them is one of our big missions. I think the other thing that we've learned
pause there.
Yeah.
Because once again, I hope I almost certainly know there are some Darren and Marks listening here. I think we have a model, especially like in the 2010s. Like I know it's 2009. The internet's here. The cloud is here. The iPhone is here. I know what that founder looks like. I know what a ZERP era founder looks like. I know what a post-COVID, everyone's awash in money founder looks like. What does a deep tech EIR style founder look like? As much as we can know about the archetype, because I don't want to limit you, but like, what are just some like useful talking points?
Well, there are some similarities with founders of prior generations, one of which is that they have to be deeply imaginative and are risk tolerant. Jumping out of a company that you're currently in or out of a program at school and saying, I want to go build something on my own. And oh, by the way, I might fail. That takes a certain risk tolerance. It takes a certain confidence and imagination. And we look for that. Those core qualities that I think have been true, in the Steve Jobs era as they are true today. Somebody that will run through a brick wall and won't take no for an answer. That's foundational to good founders in kind of any sector. But I think in deep tech, there are a few things that are specific. One, again, the technologies we're working with are deeply technical. So they have to have at least the acumen to understand the technology, but most importantly, to think about the different use cases that technology might be used for. So often you find amazing research in one area that's targeted toward one specific market or one specific use case. Maybe it's to a Department of Energy use case if it's in a national lab. And the work of an amazing founder is to say, well, let's start at the problem. What problem am I obsessed with solving? And how might this technology be used in a different application for that space? So that's one core area. That's what I call a kind of unconstrained creativity that you look for in a deep tech founder. Some technical acumen. And I think, again, some of those core attributes around courage, building a team, and maybe most importantly in deep tech, being able to tell the story. At the end of the day, you're going to need to be able to raise from other patient capital. You have to make the case that folks should be patient around all the engineering hurdles are going to go through, all the setbacks. As somebody who helped to run a hardware company and has several, in fact, one building right behind me, you're going to have many engineering timelines that get totally blown up. You need to make the case as a founder of a deep tech company that stick with me through this, because the impacts and the outcomes of what I'm building are going to be world changing. It's not a software startup with a small moat. This is a foundational technology that has real defensibility, solving real problems, and is important to the country. I think that that's a key way that we look for EIRs and entrepreneurs, and at least at Roadrunner in the deep tech space.
So to take us out, what was the other takeaway you're about to offer before I ask the follow-up?
Well, it's related, I think, Marshall, to a lot of what you're digging into here in this podcast. Venture capital is not enough to get these technologies into companies. You have to be able to partner with the government for non-dilutive grant funding. We talked earlier around the role of government in actually doing the research and development, what I'll call a form of patient capital, which is investing in national priorities for a decade so that when they are mature in 5, 6, 7 years, they can be used by the capital markets. Another form of support that's so integral, and it's a lesson that we've learned and I think that we've really seized upon in the last years, we have to be able in deep tech to raise government capital, usually non-dilutive grant funding from places like the NSF or the Economic Development Authority of a state or the Department of Commerce or the Department of Defense through cyber funding. We have to find ways to raise that capital alongside us, particularly if it can buy down key engineering risk. And we've had I think the achievement, thanks to the team and our amazing founders, of raising, roughly $2 million of non-dilutive grant funding over the last year. And I tell the team all the time, we get the highest ROI, the highest dollar ROI we can find is $1 when in partnership with the government, because they're buying down that engineering risk instead of venture capital putting $1 in. And that partnership on each of our companies, it's been a key lesson learned. It's something that we continue to focus on as a key competency of the studio, something we offer every founder. We say, not only are we going to help you raise money, we're also going to help you go raise non-dilutive grant funding that doesn't dilute you, that buys down your engineering risk. And oh, by the way, oftentimes it connects you to a customer. Because if you're getting non-dilutive grant funding from the NSF or the FDA or the DoD or EDD, oftentimes they turn around and say, hey, I'd really like to use that alkaline electrolyzer you guys are building that we helped develop. Could you go do that for one of our utility companies? We'd love to make the connection. It's another key lesson learned. Start with the founder. That's the limiting constraint, and it's the single most important thing. It cannot be lost in deep tech. And 2, you got to find ways to partner with the government. If you do it, your companies are starting at the 25-yard line. You're not making them start at the goal line. They're starting with some capital alongside them and alongside you. And by the way, it's high ROI capital.
Those are perfect takeaways. Adam, thank you so much for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy. Folks can find more about Roadrunner and all the reference points in the show notes. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Marshall.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.